just give me a thumbs up. Yeah, great. And I'll also say that I am going to not look at the Slack channel while I present, because I'm not able to multitask that way, but hopefully Michael and Jeff can take questions as they come. So this is joint work with Jeff Gortmaker, who's a super talented PhD student at Harvard, and Michael Lee, who's at the New York Fed, also super talented. So we have the standard disclaimer that the views in this paper don't necessarily reflect those of the Fed. Okay, so the key question that we're asking in this paper is, how do workers respond to news about their firm's credit condition? We have a couple of questions that motivate us. So one is that there's recent evidence that workers jump ship leading into bankruptcy. So we're curious as to when they start paying attention to signals of the firm's credit condition. Do they react to sort of smaller signs of changing credit situation? Second is that we're going to be looking at signals from rating agencies. And so to the extent that that reflects, external monitoring and public signals, does that constitute new information to employees? And finally, networks are playing an important role in labor market dynamics. So we hope to contribute in understanding what kind of events affect network formation. So in this paper, we're looking at connection activity on LinkedIn, and we're going to look at whether that increases or changes following negative credit rating news. We're also going to be able to ask whether there are any cross-sectional differences in who responds and to what extent. And lastly, we're going to touch on whether workers respond similarly to other news besides negative credit rating news. I'll have just a couple of events that I'll show you. So why use LinkedIn activity? Most observable labor outcomes come from slow-moving processes. So, for example, changes in employment, whether people leave their jobs. And that's really important, but a downside of those types of events is that they're very slow moving, so it's hard to tie them closely to events. And they're also pretty costly to workers. Like changing your job is pretty costly. So, something that you're going to see really if there are serious conditions or serious events that trigger a change, but it's harder to detect smaller responses. So what's nice about our setting is that we observe time-stamped connections on LinkedIn. So we're going to be able to tie connection activity really closely to the events that we look at. Another nice thing about connections is that connecting is relatively cheap, so we can observe smaller reactions, and we can sort of look at more nuance in the reaction because it's not a binary thing. You can connect to a bunch of people or just a couple. So the main measure that we're going to look at is connections initiated by employees of a firm. So essentially number of connections initiated in a given week divided by the number of employees of the firm who are on the LinkedIn platform. And then we're going to match this to employment histories that we have access to also on LinkedIn. By the way, we don't have anyone's names. Everything's de-identified, but we have unique identifiers to map all the data together. So these employment histories tell us when people are employed where. There's also some standardized occupation detail that we'll use to look at seniority cuts and occupation cuts. We build out a weekly panel by firm, essentially, or by firm seniority group or by firm occupation group. And to give you a sense, the median sample in our firm has a little over 900 employees on LinkedIn. So we do observe a lot of employees on LinkedIn. The weekly connection rate is maybe a connection every 2 or 3 weeks, a new connection every 2 or 3 weeks for every employee. And annual departure rate is 13.5% for the median. So we're going to merge this with credit rating data from Moody's and S&P. We're going to focus on long-term issuer level ratings. And specifically, we're going to focus on negative credit watches as our main event of interest. So these negative credit watches, or down watches as we'll call them, are situations where the rating agency flags that they are considering changing the rating. They're considering a downgrade, but they aren't changing the rating yet. And we like this because it tends to be less expected than actual rating changes. Rating changes are often preceded by either a change in a credit watch or another rating change. And they don't have some of the automatic consequences that can be triggered with rating changes. So we use this as a cleaner information signal, but we do have robustness to looking at unexpected downgrades that I'll show if there's extra time at the end, or you can ask me about. We're also going to use earnings surprises from IBES to define missed earnings events as a comparison point for an alternative economic event. We'll define that as the consensus error being in the bottom decile for the year. So we merged this data with the LinkedIn data that we have to end up with a panel of publicly traded non-financial firms between 2008 and 2017, inclusive. We end up with about 400 downwatch events that we look at, and then a little more than half of that, as many upwatches, close to 1,000 unexpected downgrades, and a couple thousand missed earnings events. Right. So our empirical approach is essentially a generalized difference in differences, but at a weekly frequency, where the main specifications that I'm going to build things off of is looking at this new initiated connection rate on the left-hand side, and looking at that for 12 weeks following a downwatch. We'll test robustness to different windows too. So the key assumptions are first, that the results, to the extent that we see a change in connections, that this is not driven by a concurrent event. So we're going to discard any downwatches or events that coincide with other announcements. And we're also going to include a lot of fixed effects to try to absorb background economic conditions, so including firm year fixed effects and industry by week fixed effects to try to remove some of those general economic conditions and focus on the impact of the downwatch itself. And then the other assumption is that this is not driven by anticipation. And so I'm going to show you weekly time series graphs for all of the results to really show you the dynamics of the effects. So let me start with just the basic diff and diff regression, where we cut that off at 12 weeks. So this is showing that following a downwatch, there's a systematically higher connection rate. This is robust to also looking at shorter windows post downwatch, so 8 weeks, 4 weeks. And to give you a sense of magnitude, this suggests that there's the weekly connection rate is between 3 and 4.5% higher than average following a downwatch. So let me show you this in graph form. This is showing by week relative to the downwatch event and accumulating things outward from T-1. So what this is showing is that in the quarter leading up to the downwatch event, that difference in connection rate is not statistically distinguishable from zero, but rather the connection rate really pops up immediately following the downwatch. So I think this is interesting that there's kind of an immediate effect, but also that it's relatively sustained. So again, this is cumulative, but that cumulative effect is sustained through the 12-week post period. So the next thing that we want to turn to is, well, who drives this reaction? And the first cross-sectional cut that we do is looking at seniority. We think that seniority could affect workers' responses in two ways. On the one hand, if you have a more senior position, by that, by the way, I mean like your manager or a director. If you're more senior, you might have better knowledge of the firm's true condition, and so you would respond less to external signals. On the other hand, you might have more at stake in the firm's financial condition, and or you might have a better understanding of the news or pay greater attention to this kind of signal. And so we might actually see a greater response from senior individuals, from senior workers to these down watches. So we classify workers into 3 broad categories. Our S1, Seniority 1 category is just entry level, and that's about 30% of the average firm. S2 is kind of the middle block, so think of senior associates and managers, and that's like half of the average firm. And then S3 is really the most senior tranche of the firm. To start with, I'm going to group S2 and S3 together as senior workers compared to entry-level workers. And when we run this in a regression setting, we see that the results are really driven by the more senior employees. So this is just showing you what happens with different fixed effects. The estimates are pretty consistent. Again, this is for senior workers, weekly connection rate is like 3 to 4% higher than average following the downwatch. And in graph form, you can see this, that the separation between the senior level employees in red and the blue entry-level employees sort of increases over time. And this suggests to us that this, so it's really the higher stakes and or the greater attention of senior workers that are more of a driver of connecting. The next thing we do is we do split up those senior workers into the mid-level and the most senior. We start running into power issues, right? Those most senior workers are just about 18% of the average firm, so it's a little bit harder to detect, but what we see suggests that there is a sort of monotonic effect in the sense that the estimates suggest a greater response for the most senior than for the mid-level, in turn greater response than for the entry level. And you can also sort of see this with the graph where in yellow, we have the most senior tranche, and they have the highest cumulative response. The red is the mid-level, the blue is the entry level. It's a little harder to parse out when there are more groups, but it's consistent with increasing effect as you get more senior. Okay, so what about skill? So there's work from Bagai, Silva, Tell, and Vig, and from Babina, suggesting that talented workers are the ones who are most likely to jump ship in bankruptcy. So we wanted to know if skill predicts earlier reactions too. So we classify workers using occupation and education levels, occupation information from LinkedIn and education levels from the BLS. We classify occupations as skilled if 50% or more of the occupation has a bachelor's degree or higher education. This yields pretty intuitive classification. The occupations you would expect show up as skilled. This does correlate a little bit with seniority, but not one-to-one, or far from that. So you do have occupations like management that are going to be more senior and more skilled, but you have occupations like engineering that in fact are you may very well have as both entry level, mid level, and not necessarily as the top executive. So when we look at this, when we interact the downwatch with whether you're in a skilled occupation or not, the results suggest that both skilled and unskilled connect in following the downwatch, but the response tends to be higher for more skilled workers. The coefficient estimates are most significant when we allow for separate firm year baselines by skilled and not skilled. So essentially when we include these year by firm by skill fixed effects. And again, I'll show you this in graph form. You can see that both the blue and the red, so the red is the skilled, the blue is the less skilled. Both increase following the downwatch, but there's a bit of separation between skilled and not skilled. And this is, what we think is driving this is maybe similar to senior employees. These more skilled employees may have more at stake, or they may be more sophisticated in understanding this news. But this suggests a potential cost to firms if skilled employees are more distracted, or if they are thinking about if they're thinking about potentially what are their other options outside of this firm. So this brings me actually to what are the motivations for workers to be increasing their LinkedIn networks following downwatches. And we can think of broadly three hypotheses. I'm sure there are more, but the three that came to our mind are first, maybe this is about jumping ship or being kicked off the ship. So in the process of actually leaving and joining a new firm, people connect more. And so maybe that's what we're seeing. Second, maybe what we're seeing is precautionary connecting. So you're not necessarily leaving now, but you're sort of building out your network in case of possible future need, in case things get worse. And then third, maybe this is tied to specific work. Maybe this is all driven by HR people who are trying to respond, or by salespeople. I am not going to get into this here, although we can if there's extra time. But we do some robustness to specific occupations, and this is really not driven by any specific occupation. So we don't think that it's this last explanation. So what we do to try to tease out the first two hypotheses is we merge the data to the employment data on LinkedIn, and we essentially create an indicator where you're leaving if you're no longer employed at the firm in the next calendar year. And there's going to be a constant within a calendar year. And then the leaving rate is going to be the number of individuals who are leaving, who are no longer present at the firm next year, divided by the number of employees at the firm. So first, I want to talk about the general relationship between connection rates and leaving rates. So this is not specific to downwatch. This is just in our full sample, what's the correlation between connection rates and leaving rates. And as you can see, it's there's a pretty strong positive association, both with contemporaneous leaving rates and with future leaving rates 1 year out, 2 year out. Again, this is not specific to downwatches. This is just in general, there is this positive correlation. In terms of who is connecting following the downwatch, what we do is we split our workers into two samples, those who are leaving, so no longer at the firm next calendar year, and those who are staying still at the firm next calendar year. And when we look at connection rates, we actually see that both leavers and stayers increased connection activity following the downwatch. So for us to suggest that the networking is not only for those who are jumping ship or being kicked off the ship, at least in the same year. This might be about people looking for potential jobs, or sort of just precautionary, we're building out our networks in case something happens in the future. Again, to show this in graph form, you see that there is a bit of separation. So the red is the leaving. Leaving do connect a little bit more, but it's not statistically different. Both leavers and stayers connect following a downwatch. And we think that this is quite interesting because it means that with this connection activity, we're picking up what I like to call the dogs that don't bark, meaning the employees who don't leave but are still paying attention to this news. Okay. So in the time that I have left, I want to I want to compare what we see here to other events. I'm going to look just at 2 other events. First, we want to know whether there's a symmetric response to positive news about the firm's credit condition. So up watches, the issuer being placed on a positive credit watch. And we're also going to look at other negative economic news that's not tied to credit situation particularly, and that's our missed earnings events. So we're going to look at events where the firm misses its target earnings by a whole lot. And before I look at connection rates, I want to suggest that these events are comparable. If we look at shareholder reactions, so the cumulative abnormal return following a downwatch is around 3%. So this is using a 4-factor model. There's a symmetric positive response to upwatches, about 2.5%. We have fewer events, so the confidence interval is wider. And then if you look at missed earnings events, if anything, the reaction is stronger. We have a cumulative abnormal return of about -4.5%. So from looking at shareholder reactions, these events are comparable, and if not, for missed earnings, even more salient. When we look at workers' reactions using this connection rate, you can see that it's really just downwatches that trigger this reaction. If we look at upwatches, we really have a flat, like no abnormal connection rates. If we look at missed earnings events, it's really pretty flat too. And so in terms of the upwatches, this is interesting for us because it suggests that negative news plays a unique role for workers. Maybe it doesn't trigger the same kind of need for making sure your networks are in place. In terms of missed earnings, I think it points for us to a different set of concerns for workers relative to shareholders. I'll point out that there's no abnormal activity leading up to the missed earnings targets either. So we don't think that this is about people know that it's coming and so they anticipate with abnormal activity. If you look, actually, I'll do this since I have a little bit of time. If you look at future departures for these different events, you see that the downwatches are most predictive of future departures. So here I have the annual leaving rate on the left-hand side. And so you see that the downwatches are most predictive of future departures. Missed earnings are a little bit predictive, but the magnitude is smaller, and then upwatches, there's not much of a relationship. So I think this is consistent with workers respond because because downwatches are what's going to matter more for them in terms of future separations. Okay, so I have some more time, but why don't I do this? I'm going to conclude, and then you can ask me more questions. I can go into more details if there are any questions. So what we do in this paper is we use LinkedIn activity to examine labor response to firms' credit deterioration. We see that workers increase networking activity following downwatches. The response is immediate, pretty notably, and the networking response is driven by senior and skilled workers. Both workers who leave and stay increase connections, so we think this is consistent with a precautionary motive. This is a work in progress, so we're trying to flesh this out more as well, and we'll be eager to see if there are any constructive suggestions here. And finally, we don't see an equivalent response to economic news like missed earnings, which suggests to us that there might be unique labor concerns when financing with debt. You don't get the same reaction to non-financial economic news. And it underlines for us that there are different matters of interest for workers and shareholders. So thanks, everyone, and I guess I will open to questions.